Hello everyone and welcome back for what is now my third series of real-time painting tutorials for Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game miniatures. In this series we're going to be painting up Ramsay Bolton, the Great John Umber, and Gregor Clegane, the Mountain That Rides. All three are really nice miniatures and I was really happy to get to paint them up. I was actually noticing the other day that Gregor Clegane is now the miniature I definitely have the most copies of, since I think I'm up to 3 now with him dismounted, helmet on and helmet off, and him riding. Anyway, this series is going to build on what we've been doing in the last two series and just add another technique now for your repertoire, and that is Zenithal Shading. So Zenithal Shading is sort of shading the items from the top as part of the priming process, or often it's done in conjunction with priming, to give your miniatures a bit of a lighting effect. Really easy, really quick lighting early on that is super effective when you're working with washes like we are with our inks here. If you've never seen any of my previous videos, I do most of my painting with inks, not with acrylic paints, and so that makes it makes the shading and the sort of any work you do on the priming ahead of time show through your colors way more than if you were painting with straight up acrylics. For all of my priming and my varnishing when we get to it, I always do it with my Badger Patriot 105 airbrush. The Badger Patriot 105 airbrush is fairly highly reviewed, and I can agree with that. It's a really sturdy, really simple machine, quick to learn the ins and outs of. Fill it up with paint, and the gravity-fed hopper just lets you feed the primer, in this case, through in a thin stream of aerosolized paint. This thin stream of aerosolized paint means that I'm not going to be applying such a thick layer of primer that I obscure the surface details below. Of course, if you don't have an airbrush and a compressor, I didn't for the longest time. I got them now when I was learning to paint again, so that it would make things a little easier, but if you don't have them, you could obviously apply your primer with a brush. It will make Zenithal Highlighting much harder though, if not impossible, since it sort of relies on the dusty application from the airbrush. That being said, if you're applying your primer with a traditional paintbrush, just be sure not to lay it on too thick. You can see, especially on the Great John and Ramsay here, there's these fur cowls they have, and that fur has some great surface detail that our washes later will flow into, and we don't want to obscure that. As you can see, the decision to do some Zenithal highlighting for the first time was actually kind of on a whim. I started priming them in light gray, and I said, what if I put some black in there, and just made it a darker primer and worked from there. So I'm mixing together about 1 part black, 1 part gray Vallejo primer in the hopper of my airbrush here. I'm just going to grab a toothpick to sort of nudge it around, and then I'm going to decide to use a broader paintbrush to just give it the best possible mixing into a dark gray color. You want a dark base for your Zenithal highlighting, because what you're doing basically is that base is going to be the shading for your miniature, and what you apply later from directly above the miniature is going to be a lighter primer or a lighter paint that in turn brightens up the miniature from the top. The reason an airbrush is so important to the process of Zenithal highlighting is that it basically just lets you dust on a very, very light coating of this highlight. Instead of, obviously, if you were applying it with a brush, you'd be getting really thick, really stark highlights. In this case, it'll sort of fade through to the darker areas. You can do it with a brush, or simulate something similar to it with dry brushing, and that's what we've been doing in the past, is dry brushing on some white to our light gray to just sort of pick out those raised areas. You could also, for a more stark effect, and it gives you a sort of a very painterly look almost, you could do the same thing with a dark primer like this, and then dry brush on white or gray, and you'd get a very aggressive shading pattern. That might be really good if you're going for a cartoony or painterly look on your miniatures. In this case, of course, I'm just going to be going ahead with my airbrush, and my priming setup evolves constantly. In this case, I've got them all on corks to use as grips for painting. That way I can get all the way around the base of the miniatures without having my fingers in the way. And those grips there, the corks, I'm sticky tacking down to my box to elevate them to such a level that I can spray all 3 miniatures one after the other. I'll tell you now that since filming this episode, I've just started priming the miniatures individually. I put a rubber glove on my left hand, I hold them up, and I prime them one by one. And I think it's actually faster than trying to do them as a batch this way, when I'm worrying about knocking them over with the flow from the airbrush, or them not sticking, or them being too top heavy, especially in the case of Gregor Clegane here. Obviously figure out what is most comfortable for you, but we're all learning all the time, right? As you're applying the primer, if you are choosing to apply it with a Badger Patriot 105 airbrush as I am, or with any other airbrush for that matter, try to keep your airbrush kind of far away from the miniatures, pull off any cat hairs as you go as necessary, and get a light layer on the miniatures. I've got a piece of cardboard behind them so that all the overspray gets caught and doesn't go all over my workspace. And you want to be sort of just catching them in the middle of the broad cone of paint, not getting right up close, because if you do get right up close, you're going to end up overloading them. They're going to obscure the surface detail, you're going to get pooling and weird shapes as it dries, and you want to avoid that. Always get your primer on thin and in a consistent coat, so that it serves really well for helping later colors to grip to the miniature. If you weren't aware, that is of course the purpose of primer, is to allow paints to grip on top of surfaces. For plastic miniatures it's not as necessary because a lot of acrylic paint loves to grip to these plastic miniatures, but especially if you ever intend to do metal miniatures, which I love, you're definitely going to want primer. I also start with primer because it's a great way to get a base color on your miniature before you move forward. I gotta take a minute here while I apply the last of this dark gray to just say that I do have links in the description below that show my list of equipment that I use in the episode, and this episode and all other episodes. Don't knock your stuff over, and if you do, watch out, make sure it didn't pick any fur up off of any surfaces or any dust or something, and make sure that the primer is still equal across the entire surface. I do have a list in the description of all the equipment I use. I also have links to my Amazon affiliate store. As an Amazon affiliate, I do earn on any qualifying purchases you make, and that's much appreciated as a way to support the channel while also getting equipment for yourself. But I'll caveat that, as I always do, with the fact that not everything is going to be cheaper online, especially with shipping in. So if you are looking at acquiring these items, look for local art stores or hobby stores first and see if you can find them there. That's going to be your best deal. Make sure as you're priming your miniatures to get under every crevice as you go forward, especially with the airbrush, where with the paintbrush you're kind of working in close the whole time. With the airbrush you're pulled back and you're applying from a distance, and you're applying generally from one direction only. With miniatures like, for example, Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides there, it's very easy to have areas that are shaded away from your airbrush, as it were. The things behind the shield, under the arm, under the horse, as you saw there was a lot of areas that were missed. So go back and really take a look at the miniature afterwards, turn it around in your hands. This is another reason why I've moved to doing them individually anyway, is I can be doing that sort of check while I'm priming the miniature at the start, and I don't need to go back and recheck it as thoroughly as I do when I'm trying to do a batch of them at once. Again, it's all about workflow. I'm showing you what I did for these miniatures, but whatever workflow works best for you, go with that. Here I just mixed up a little bit more of the primer, and you can see I'm applying quite a lot. Those folds in his horse's caparison, his cloak, under his arms, that kind of stuff, have all been great ways to block my airbrush from getting into all the nooks and crannies that I need to fill in with my primer in order for him to be finished. So going ahead with that, just filling it all in. It's also getting, you can see, a little glossy, a little thick on the miniature. I'm not overly worried about that though, because the primer does shrink a little bit when it dries. Don't rely on that, but you can use that as a bit of a backstop if you are ending up having to go back and cover up areas again and again. It'll shrink into a lot of the nooks as it dries. Now here I've washed off my airbrush, and I've put in a little bit of the Vallejo light gray primer that I'm going to be using as my highlight here. I'm not just using a white paint because I want, another layer of primer just to be sure, but now I'm holding the miniature very, very far away and using about half of the power of my airbrush and dusting them from the top. The one thing I did here that I would do different, or do different ever since, is I did this step very, very shortly after applying the dark primer, and the two sort of blended together, so it didn't give quite as much contrast as I was thinking. It would, just based on the fact that the primer was still wet. I'm sorry, my elbow's in the way there. When I do the mountain here, you're gonna have a much better view of what I'm doing. So I'm just applying the primer from the top and sort of rocking the miniature back and forth. I'm trying to make sure that all areas get lightened, and this time I sort of flinched and wanted everywhere to be extremely light because I was worried how well the ink would show on the dark primer. You can take my word and say it does show reasonably well even on dark primer. So be sort of artistic with your highlights. Try to make them as stark as possible. Make it really bright on top, make it fade down. But just work your way down to the airbrush and make it all fade together. It's really nice looking at the end, and you could almost just use the miniatures once this has been done as like statues or something for scenery in your games. Like I said, maybe wait a little longer between applying your dark primer and your highlight, but aside from that, that's the gist of your azimuthal or zenithal highlighting, as people call it. It's not that crazy. You can do it even without an airbrush if you have like rattle can paints, so get a hold of those if you can. And I do recommend it. It did help a lot in terms of just giving depth to the colors as I put them on later. And with that, we conclude today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed yourself. For those of you who've been subscribed or have been coming back and seeing my episodes, time after time, thanks so much for sticking with me. For any new viewers, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you're looking forward to the next episode as we carry on to go color the miniatures themselves. If you got any comments or any questions, throw them down in the comments below. I'd be happy to read them and, fling you back an answer as quickly as I can. All that being said, thanks again, and go play some games.